Hello students, today I'll be recording part 2 of my lecture on chapter 12, unemployment. Quick recap of what we learned in part 1. In part 1 we focused on frictional unemployment. Right, and here we studied steady state, the steady state unemployment rate. And this was calculated as the following fraction. It was L divided by H plus L times 100, where L is the probability of job loss in any period, right? So L was the probability of job loss in any period, and H is the probability of being hired, of finding a job, correct? So this was our steady state unemployment rate. And the other concept that we dealt with was the asking wage, right? The asking wage, WA. And how was this, how does a worker arrive at his or her asking wage? This is the diagram we had. On the horizontal axis, we measure the current wage offer. So remember that the worker is facing not a single wage, but a distribution of wages, correct? And so let's say the worker's current wage is a certain value, right? And well, we can now figure out whether it's worthwhile to continue searching, right? And so the benefit from continued search is given by the negatively sloped marginal benefit curve. Now, why does the marginal benefit of continued search decrease in the current wage offer? Well, because if the worker receives a low wage offer like this, let's say W1, then given the distribution of wages, there is a high probability that the worker's next wage offer shall be higher than this, because this is a very low wage offer, correct? So the bulk of the distribution lies to the right of W1. So there's a very high probability that this worker will be able to, next time, receive an offer that's higher than this, right? So therefore, the marginal benefit from continued search is quite high at this point, height of this dotted line. On the other hand, if the worker receives a high wage offer, let's call that W2, now the probability of continued search, or rather the benefit, the marginal benefit from continued search is small, because the probability that the worker will find another job paying a higher wage is quite low, right? So this is why the marginal benefit curve from further search is negatively sloped, right? So this is marginal benefit from continued search, CONTD, continued search, right? And then in this very diagram, we can throw in a marginal cost curve. And the marginal cost curve has at least a slope of 1, correct? So well, it would be something like this. And you could, so this is the marginal cost of continued search. And it has a slope of 1. The angle is a 45-degree angle, and that's because if the worker receives a wage offer of $5 and decides to reject it and continue searching, well, the opportunity cost of continued search is that $5 that's been given up, correct? But to this, we might add this additional cost, right? This cost, you might think of this as the direct cost of search. So this would be the cost of actually mailing out applications and so on. Perhaps driving around looking for help wanted sign, etc., or subscribing to the newspapers so that you can look at the job ads. right? So that's the direct cost of search, and the slope here is, that's a 45-degree angle, which has a slope of 1. Slope of 1, why? Because if the offered wage goes up by $1 from $5 to $6, the marginal cost will go up by exactly that same $1, right? Because the opportunity cost of continued search now goes up from $5 to $6. Right? Now the intersection of these two we learnt in part 1 of my lecture. Now, this gives rise to the worker's asking wage. Now remember, in sequential job search, the worker has this asking wage in mind and continues searching until he or she receives a wage either equal to it or higher than it. Right? If, on the other hand, if a wage offer is less than the asking wage, the worker immediately rejects it and continues searching. Right? So these are the concepts involved with explaining frictional unemployment. So what this essentially tells us that even in the best of times, there will always be some frictional unemployment because of job search. Right? So even when an economy is booming, a worker faced with a distribution of wages will not simply take any old job that comes his way. He might be choosy, right? He might reject an offer, continue searching if the wage offer is less than the worker's asking wage. So this is a brief recap. Today, the next thing that we will do is we will look at cyclical unemployment. So that's the next thing that we will study here. Cyclical unemployment. Again, remember that there are 3 kinds of, or rather 4 kinds of unemployment, but we'll focus on 3. The 4 kinds of unemployment that was mentioned in part 1 of my lecture is, or are, frictional unemployment. So we have frictional unemployment, and then we have seasonal unemployment. We really won't deal much with seasonal unemployment. And then we have structural unemployment. And finally, cyclical unemployment. So we've dealt with this. This we are really not going to deal with. I'm now next going to talk about this, and then finally structural unemployment, cyclical unemployment. Now there is a puzzle here. There is a puzzle with cyclical unemployment, and the puzzle is the following. It is inconsistent with a competitive market. And let me explain why it's inconsistent. It's inconsistent because if you draw a diagram like this for a labor market, so we have the quantity of labor on the horizontal axis and the wage on the vertical axis. And let me throw in a demand curve for labor and then a supply curve of labor, right? And we have market equilibrium where the 2 curves intersect, right? So this gives us the equilibrium wage, W star. It also then gives us the equilibrium level of employment, correct? So in this setup, there is no unemployment. There is no unemployment because the quantity demanded of labor equals the quantity supplied of labor, right? So remember, you can only have unemployment when there is an excess supply of labor, right? So this is the demand curve, and that's the supply curve. You can have unemployment only when there is a gap, a horizontal gap between the 2 curves, when the quantity supplied of labor, meaning the workers wish to work, exceed a number, the number of workers that firms wish to hire. But in this case, with the market clearing, meaning with equilibrium in the market, there is no unemployment, correct? Now let's say there's a recession, right? Let's say a recession hits this economy. So with a recession, the firm's demand for labor is going to decrease, right? Because what happens in a recession? The 4 shoppers in the economy, meaning households, firms, the government, and the rest of the world, they all reduce their shopping, right? And if they reduce their shopping, firms in turn are going to reduce their demand for workers, right? Because the demand for workers is a derived demand. It depends upon customers' demand for firms' products, right? So with customers' demand for firms' products shrinking in a recession, firms' demand for labor will decrease. So this demand curve will shift like this to the left, correct? But now, here's the puzzle. With this situation, well, we should have come to a new equilibrium here. So what should happen is the equilibrium wage ought to drop to a lower level, and the amount of employment would also drop to a lower level. Again, you would have no unemployment. But this doesn't seem to be happening, right? In other words, you have this leftward shift in the demand curve, but this wage here doesn't fall. That's the only way we can explain rising cyclical unemployment when there is a recession, right? Now, if this wage here is stuck, for instance, at the old value W star here, then with the demand curve shifting to the left, the quantity demanded of labor shall be this, correct? Whereas the quantity supplied of labor will continue to be this old L star. And now we have quantity supplied bigger than quantity demanded, hence unemployment, right? So in order to explain cyclical unemployment, we need some rigidity. So we need rigidity in the wage, correct? Otherwise, we can't explain cyclical unemployment, at least in terms of this framework of a competitive labor market, right? All right, so let me move to my next page. So let me quickly recap this again. So in order to explain unemployment in the framework of a competitive market, this is what we need in any given time period. Let's say we are in a recession. Well, this is what we need: demand curve, supply curve. Let me label the axes: quantity of labor, demand curve for labor, supply curve of labor, and here we have a wage on the vertical axis, right? And this here is the market clearing wage, the equilibrium wage, W star. But in order to explain cyclical unemployment, we would need the following. We would need the wage to be higher than that, right? And let me call it W underbar. Only then would we have unemployment, and this would be the amount of unemployment. That horizontal gap, how's that? Because this distance here, well, this would be the quantity demanded of labor by businesses, and this is the quantity supplied of labor by workers. And here we have the excess supply of labor, which is what we call unemployed labor, unemployment, right? So we need to explain why in this labor market the wage is going to be stuck here. In other words, it'll be above W star. So we need an explanation for that, and that explanation is what I'm going to now dwell on for a few minutes, okay? And the explanation is something called efficiency wages. So what does this explain? This explains why the wage may be bigger than the equilibrium wage. And that's the only way we can explain unemployment within the framework of a competitive market. So what is the efficiency wages argument? The efficiency wages argument is simply this, that firms realize that workers work well, work better when you pay them well, right? So in other words, worker efficiency is positively related to the wage. So this implies that firms may be willing to pay workers a wage that is greater than the equilibrium wage. Right? Because firms know that if you pay workers well, they work harder. And when they work harder, they produce more output, and this may raise firms' profits despite paying the workers a higher wage. Right? And there was a very famous historical person in the US who realized this early on, and he was Henry Ford. Right, and Henry Ford did what? Well, back in, I think this was in was perhaps 1914, I'm guessing, because, you know, in the vicinity of 1914, he began to pay his workers $5 a day, which was almost double the going wage rate in the automobile industry. Henry Ford began to pay his workers twice what his competitors were paying. And this was to boost productivity in his factories. Right? With that higher wage, what happens? Well, two things happen when you pay workers a wage that is greater. The two consequences are, there is first, as a result of this higher wage, you have gratitude, also fear. And what's the gratitude? Well, if the firm pays the worker well, the worker feels a sense of gratitude, and that might induce the worker to work harder. The second one is fear, and the fear works in the following way. The worker knows quite well that the wage he is currently receiving from Henry Ford is twice as high as what others are paying in the industry. So if the worker were to shirk, were to goof off and be caught at it and sacked, the worker would have to go to a much lower paying job, because the only jobs out there in the automobile industry pay only half as much as what Henry Ford is paying. So there is also fear then. A fear is induced by paying the worker a higher wage. Right? So that's really the efficiency wages argument. Right? So again, what is the efficiency wages argument? It is a justification for why the wage in the market, in the labor market, may be higher than the market clearing or equilibrium wage. Right? And we need the wage to be higher than W star in order to explain any excess supply of labor or unemployment. Okay. So let's delve into the efficiency wages argument again, some more detail. And the argument is simply this. First, let's lay out some assumptions. And there's one assumption, and that is that monitoring worker effort is expensive. So this is something we need here. Right? In other words, it's expensive for businesses to monitor workers, to ensure that they're working hard. It's difficult, perhaps, to observe the effort that's possible. Right? It might also be that observing and therefore observing workers' effort is expensive. Right? So, for instance, in a automobile factory, to ensure that workers are working hard, you might have to post supervisors every 5 workers or so, and pay those supervisors, of course, high wages, so they do a good job supervising. Expensive. That's the point, right? So monitoring worker effort is expensive, right? So the only way that therefore this implies that the cheaper way of ensuring effort from workers is to scare them. It's to scare them. And how do you scare them? Right? Now, worker fear depends on 2 things. Worker fear depends on 2 things. First, it depends on the wage, or the extent to which the wage is greater than the equilibrium wage. So it depends on that gap, the wage minus the equilibrium wage. So if you pay a wage that is greatly above the equilibrium wage, the fear factor will be bigger, because the worker will be afraid to lose this plum job, right? So that's something that increases. So there's a positive relationship between this wage minus W star, the actual wage paid minus the competitive wage, the equilibrium wage. The higher that is, the bigger the worker fear, right? And the other factor that affects the worker fear is the unemployment rate, unemployment out there, or the unemployment rate in the labor market. If there is a lot of unemployment in the labor market, this is going to make the worker think that, well, there are a lot of unemployed workers out there. If I were to lose my job, it would take me a very long time to find another, because in the economy, the unemployment rate is very high, right? So the higher the unemployment rate out there, the greater the worker fear. So the firm has to essentially, or firms as group, have to work with these two items here to increase worker fear, right? Because to make the worker fearful ensures that the worker works hard. Now, why is this the preferable way of doing things? Because monitoring worker effort is not practical. It's very expensive. It's difficult to do, right? So let's not bother with monitoring worker effort. Let's instead put the fear of God into the worker, fear of losing his job, let's say, right? All right, so we need the following diagram now. Okay, so let me draw the following diagram for the labor market. I'm going to draw the market demand curve, the market supply curve. Quantity of labor, the wage, demand curve, supply curve, and this here is the competitive wage W star. Right, so as I said, in order to make the worker fearful and therefore work hard, firms have to pay a wage that is higher than W star. Correct? All right, and also you want there to be unemployment, correct? So this is what the firms could do. Let's say that firms decide, well, hang on, let me actually modify this diagram a little bit. Let me modify this according to what you have in your book. So your book makes a certain simplification. My apologies. Let me erase this supply curve. Your book makes a simplifying assumption, and that actually makes life a little easier, and that is they assume that the quantity supplied of labor is constant. So in other words, the assumption is going to be that the supply curve of labor is a vertical line. Right, so let's just work with this. This is going to be simpler. So this is the supply curve of labor. Right? And here is L star. All right, so let's start with the following. Let's say that firms decide to hire, even though there are so many workers, L star workers are willing, or let's say number of workers willing to work. That's L star, correct? The quantity supplied of labor, which is fixed, constant. So the number of workers willing to work is L star, right? And let's say firms do the following. Firms decide to hire only L1. So what is this? This is the number of workers firms choose to hire, right? And the firm, remember, the firm wants to hire workers who will not shirk, right? So I ought to add here the number of non-shirking workers, workers who don't goof off, in other words. So the number of non-shirking workers firms choose to hire, let's say that's L1. In this case, since firms are hiring only L1 of the L star workers willing to work, what's going to be unemployment in the economy? The unemployment in the economy is going to be this large amount. So that's the unemployment, high unemployment. Now, if there is high unemployment, this of course means that workers are, as it is, fearful. The workers who are hired are going to be fearful of losing their job because there is high unemployment out there. So therefore, this tells us that in order to induce effort, firms have to pay workers only a little bit above W star. Only a little bit above W star. Let me explain this. So this combination here, write that a bit smaller. So this was the original, the equilibrium wage is here, it's W star, and let's call this wage here W1. So my point here is that this combination W1, L1, what is that combination? Well, that is a combination that's going to ensure that these L1 workers hired do not shirk. How is that? Because when you hire these L1 workers, you have this large amount of unemployment, correct? And you're also then paying these workers a bit more than the equilibrium wage in perfect competition. So you're paying them more, and there is also high unemployment. But the point here is that you don't have to pay them much more than W star, because the fear factor is already quite high on account of the high unemployment. Correct? Now, another possibility would be this, that the firm could induce the same amount of fear by doing the following, by hiring more workers, L2, but if L2 workers were hired, then unemployment in the economy would be lower. You see the gap between L2 and L star is smaller. So the fear factor from unemployment now, from the prospect of unemployment, that fear would have reduced in workers because there is less unemployment out there. So in order to induce the same amount of fearfulness as before, what will the firm have to do? The firm will have to pay a wage that is much higher than the W star. So this is another combination then, right? So let's call that wage W2. So W2, L2 is another combination that ensures no shirking. Yes? So essentially then we end up with, if you pass a line through the red dot and the blue dot, we would essentially end up with a no shirking supply curve of labor. Right? And let me draw a fresh diagram to show that. Okay, so let me draw a fresh diagram to show the no shirking supply curve of labor. So demand curve, market supply curve. Oh, sorry, I got that wrong. Supply curve is not positively sloped, it's a vertical line in our case here. Sorry about that again. Like this, right? So supply, demand, and the quantity supplied of labor is QS, and that is also the competitive equilibrium quantity of labor, right? So that's fixed. We assume that's fixed for simplicity, right? And this here is the competitive equilibrium wage. And I'm going to draw a line like this now. And this line gives us the combinations of wage and workers hired. Combinations of the wage and workers hired that ensure that all the hired workers do not shirk on account of fear. Right? So all these combinations of wage, let's call this here W1, L1, W2, L2. All of these combinations, W1, L1, W2, L2, these are all combinations of wages and workers hired by firms that ensure that the hired workers are fearful enough not to shirk. Right? Now, when hiring is greater at L2, why does the wage also have to rise? Because when hiring by firms increases from L1 to L2, the amount of unemployment out there shrinks to this amount. So fear from unemployment, fear from the prospect of unemployment on the part of the hired worker reduces. So in order to maintain fear, the firm will have to do what? Increase pay. Because remember, fear comes from two sources. One is to lose this nice, highly paying job, right? And the second aspect of fear is, the second root of fears is the prospect of unemployment, right? So by increasing hiring from L1 to L2, the firm reduces unemployment, hence the prospect of unemployment. So unemployment is no longer so fearful, such a fearful prospect for the firm, for the worker, right? Because if the unemployment out there is low, the worker may think, well, if I lose my current job, I'll be able to find one quickly enough because the unemployment out there is quite low, right? So in order to keep the worker as fearful as before, the firm will have to resort to its other tool, which is raise the gap between the wage and the competitive wage. The wage minus W star has to be increased. In other words, the firm will have to raise the wage, correct? So this is the no shirking frontier. So all along this combination, this curve, the workers hired L1, L2, etc., they will not shirk because they will be fearful, adequately fearful, sufficiently fearful. Correct? So given this no shirking frontier, now the question is, what particular wage will firms choose to pay? Will firms choose to pay? Firms have all of these options. They can pay W1, W2, any wage along this no shirking frontier will basically discourage shirking. Correct? But which wage will it choose? Well, here, of course, the argument is that the firms will choose this particular wage. This particular wage and employment combination, let's call that WNS, right? And employment will be this, right? And let's call that LNS. Let me do a little bit of erasing here. Why is that? Why would that particular combination be chosen? Because that combination of wage and workers employed lies on the demand curve, right? And all these combinations of wage and employment on the demand curve ensure that the firm is maximizing profits, right? Because after all, this demand curve comes from profit maximization, right? This is nothing but if you remember, this is nothing but the value of the marginal product of labor, right? So if the wage is WNS and workers hired is LNS, right? This particular combination is profit maximizing. Not only is it profit maximizing, it also ensures that all these workers hired do not shirk, correct? So you have these twin benefits. One, no shirking. Second, profit maximization. Right? So that's the argument. So this WNS then is going to be the efficiency wage. The efficiency wage in this industry or in this labor market. Right? Now we observe here that the efficiency wage is way above W star. Correct? So at this efficiency wage, what's going to be the amount of unemployment? The amount of unemployment, of course, is going to be this gap here. So this will be the amount of unemployment. Correct? So we've learned here that even though this market is supposed to come to equilibrium, right here, this is where the supply and demand curves intersect, in which case there would not be any unemployment. Well, this argument tells us that because it's expensive to monitor workers, firms like to make workers fearful, and this fear can be induced by paying a wage WNS, correct? Paying the wage WNS and hiring LNS workers, right? Now these LNS workers hired will not shirk because this combination WNS-LNS lies on the red no shirking frontier, correct? So they won't shirk, and that's also a profit maximizing combination, right? So this is the way to explain unemployment, right? Now what about a recession? Let's say a recession hits. So let me go to a new page to talk about what would happen if there is a recession in the economy. So let me replicate that diagram. Supply of labor, demand for labor, correct? Quantity of labor, demand curve, supply curve. And this here is the equilibrium wage, W star, right? Let me draw the no-shirk frontier. The no-shirk frontier is like this, correct? So this is the no-shirk frontier. And what's going to be the wage that firms choose to pay, the efficiency wage? It's going to be this, and WNS, that's the efficiency wage, correct? And what's going to be the quantity of the number of workers hired at that wage? That, of course, is given by the demand curve. And so LNS workers will be hired, whereas the quantity of workers who wish to work is QS. And so that's the unemployment. Correct? All right, now let's have a recession hit this economy. In a recession, what would happen? In a recession, the demand curve for labor that you see here would shift downward, like this, leftwards rather. You have a decrease in the demand for labor. So a recession will cause the demand curve for labor to shift leftwards. A decrease in demand. Correct? So with this decrease in demand, what happens to the new efficiency wage? The new efficiency wage is going to be given by this point here, where the new demand curve, the blue demand curve, intersects the no-shirking frontier. So we have a slight drop in the wage that firms pay now. The new efficiency wage is WNS prime with an apostrophe, right? And what happens to the number of workers employed? The number of workers employed is LNS prime. What happens to the amount of unemployment? The amount of unemployment is now bigger than before. So this is the unemployment in the recession. And you can see that's a larger amount of unemployment than before, right? This unemployment is bigger than the old unemployment, correct? The old unemployment was this gap, correct? This was the old unemployment. So this explains cyclical unemployment, right? This is an explanation of cyclical unemployment. What is cyclical unemployment again? It's the unemployment that increases in recessions and goes down during economic expansions, during booms. Goes down during booms, goes up during recessions. And this explains it quite well, I think, right? So the efficiency wages argument explains. So in summary, the efficiency wage explains the existence of unemployment even when the labor market is competitive. B explains the increase in unemployment in a recession, right? Is there any evidence of efficiency wages? Well, there is some evidence, and let me explain the evidence. So evidence for efficiency wages. And the evidence is basically that it's been found that there is a negative relationship between the unemployment rate and wages across regions, across regional labor markets. In other words, in labor markets where the unemployment rate is low, wages tend to be high. Now, why is this evidence of efficiency wages? I'll tell you why. Because if there was no efficiency wages, if the market was simply competitive, right, demand and supply, and we can only have, remember, we can only have unemployment when the wage is like this above W star. That's W star. So let's call that wage W1, in which case that distance there, that solid line, the solid gap between the supply curve and the demand curve, that's unemployment, right? If the wage goes up to W2, the unemployment rate would increase. There would be more unemployment, correct? If the wage were to rise even further to W3, the horizontal gap widens even further. So in this framework here, you should have, this framework implies a positive relationship between the unemployment rate, UR, and wages in labor markets. But what we have is a negative relationship, correct? Now, why is the negative relationship evidence of an efficiency wage? Well, let's again look at our no shirking frontier. What does no shirking frontier tell us? It basically says that along the no shirking frontier, as you go from, let me quickly draw the no shirking frontier once again. Right, the no shirking frontier is like this, correct? Right, and I'm going to draw a vertical line for the quantity supplied of labor, right? So what we find here is that as the wage goes up, right, as the wage goes up from W1 to W2 to W3, along this frontier, what happens? Firms are hiring more, right? But what happens to the gap? Remember, that gap is unemployment, right? So that gap shrinks, right? So the higher the wage, the lower the unemployment along the no shirking frontier, right? That's why this observed negative relationship can be construed as evidence of the existence of a no shirking frontier, right? If there was no such frontier, then the only way to explain unemployment would be in terms of this diagram. And by this diagram, well, here too we could draw a vertical, labor supply curve with no change. In fact, let me do that. Okay, let me explain. This. So let me just redo this diagram with a vertical labor supply curve, just for consistency's sake, right? Because in our efficiency wage argument, that's what we had. Right, so vertical supply curve like this, demand curve like this, correct? And This is the equilibrium wage, no unemployment. If the wage is higher, we end up with some unemployment. I'll show you what that unemployment is in a second. Unemployment would be this dotted distance, correct? If the wage were to rise even further, then you can see that the unemployment, which is the length of that dotted line, increases. Unemployment, remember, is the excess supply of labor. If the wage were to rise even further, more unemployment. So this would lead to a positive relationship between the wage and unemployment. But we don't have a positive relationship. What's observed out there is a negative relationship, which is consistent with a positively sloped, no shirking frontier. Right? So that's evidence of efficiency wages. All right. We now have, let me present an alternative explanation. Alternative explanation of cyclical unemployment. Right? And this has to do with the intertemporal substitution hypothesis. So what is the intertemporal substitution hypothesis? I think we encountered this when we were discussing, was it labor supply? The idea here is that along the business cycle, the wages could change as well. You see, so so what this requires is a pro-cyclical real wage, which means that during a boom, wages go up, during recessions, wages go down. Right? Now, if this were true, let's consider a life cycle model of labor supply. Right? Now, if you're a worker and this is a recession, and wages have fallen, and you know that in the future the economy is going to boom again, wages are going to go up, you may decide to do the following. In this period of a wage slump, you may decide to become unemployed. Take time off because it's not worth working, in a sense. Wages have dropped. So you drop out of the, so this is like a voluntary unemployment story. You're okay with being unemployed now in a recession because wages are low. And you take it easy now. You might do a little bit of job search to, let the government know that you're unemployed and to draw unemployment benefits, right? But really what you're waiting for is the coming economic boom when wages will rise, when it'll become worthwhile for you to re-enter the labor force in a sense. But technically you're still in the labor force because you're ostensibly engaged in job search, supposedly engaged in job search, but you really may be just goofing off enjoying leisure. But you take up a job once the economy improves because wages have gone up and now it's worthwhile for you to work, right? So this would bring about higher unemployment in recessions, right? So with intertemporal substitution going on, right? So substitution of what kind of substitution is this? This is the substitution of leisure for consumption or income, right? So in other words, when the real wage falls, in a recession, the opportunity cost of leisure falls. But that's what the wage is, right? When we discussed labor supply early on in this course. The wage is simply the opportunity cost of consuming leisure, right? So it becomes cheaper to consume leisure. So this then leads to workers consuming more leisure, meaning becoming unemployed. So many workers will do this, consume more leisure during recessions, therefore seeming to be unemployed, and this of course will cause the unemployment numbers to go up in a recession. Right? On the other hand, when there is a boom, the opposite happens, right? So in a boom, the opposite happens. So when the real wage rises in an economic expansion, the opportunity cost of leisure rises. And this causes workers to consume less leisure, which causes voluntary unemployment to decrease. Right? So this might explain cyclical unemployment. So the unemployment rate goes up in a recession because the opportunity cost of leisure is decreased. Workers will rather consume leisure now, knowing full well that in the future wages will rise, in which case they will give up leisure and work more. And the unemployment rate then will fall. Right? So so this is a strange sort of story. It's not a very plausible story because here we have, firstly, the unemployment here is voluntary unemployment. And clearly in a recession, you don't have voluntary unemployment. Workers are involuntarily unemployed. They are unhappy at being unemployed. That's clear enough. There is a lot of economic hardship during recessions. Correct? So it goes against the what's out there. Right? The stories that unemployed workers tell. This is not consistent with that. Right? The other problem, of course, with this is this depends upon a pro-cyclical real wage. So this is critical. You need that to happen. Otherwise, the story doesn't. The story depends on that. Correct? Is the real wage pro-cyclical? And in fact, evidence suggests that wages may not be pro-cyclical. They could be sticky. So the evidence says that there might be sticky wages, not pro-cyclical wages. So that's one argument against this view. And the other thing that this depends on is this depends on this argument depends on a high elasticity of labor supply, meaning when wages go up, the worker decides to work more, move out of unemployment into work. And on the other hand, when the wage is low, as in a recession, the worker takes more time off, in a sense. So you need the worker's labor supply to be quite sensitive to the wage. So you need a high elasticity of labor supply. Now, in the chapter on labor supply, we learned that the supply of labor, supply of at least male labor, is very inelastic. So that too is kind of against this story. Right? It's inconsistent with the story because the story depends on a post-cyclical real wage. In real life, the real wage may in fact be sticky. Right? The other argument is that this argument of sort of voluntary unemployment in recessions depends upon a high elasticity of labor supply, but in real life, at least male labor supply is quite inelastic. So this is not really a plausible story, right? And we finally will talk about our third kind of unemployment, which is structural unemployment. Now remember that this is unemployment caused by the changing structure of the economy. And this kind of unemployment could in fact be long-term unemployment. Why long-term? Because such workers can only become employable again if they acquire new skills, right? So this could be long-term. Right? So the story here is that you could have sector-specific shocks. So some sectors are experiencing a negative shock specific to them. And this could be because of changing patterns of international comparative advantage, right? So other countries can produce the steel, let's say, cheaper than US steel factories. And this is basically in the nature of a negative shock on the steel industry, right? So the real culprit here then is sector-specific shocks. And there is some evidence that in regions where there is unbalanced growth, when different sectors, some sectors are prospering and others are not, in those areas there seems to be more long-term unemployment. So there is some evidence of structural unemployment being an issue, right? So the central story here is one of skills mismatch. Skills mismatch. So the structurally unemployed worker doesn't have skills that firms currently need, right? And so this leads to unemployment. And that is really all I have to say about structural unemployment, right? Again, bottom line, for these people to become employable again, they have to acquire new skills that are currently in demand. A steel worker who's been laid off, all he knows is how to make steel, but that is not a skill that is in high demand because the industry is shrinking. This person has to learn new skills to become employable again. Finally, let's talk about the Phillips curve. Phillips curve. And the Phillips curve is essentially, you may have encountered this in principles of macroeconomics. The Phillips curve, at least the short-term Phillips curve, looks like this. So you have the unemployment rate on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis you have the rate of inflation. And so what the economist Phillips discovered was that there was this negative relationship in the United States. So if you look at data for the 60s, for instance, during years in which the unemployment rate was high, the rate of inflation was low. On the other hand, when the unemployment rate was low, the rate of inflation was high, right? So how can we explain this in terms of, let's say, what we've learned in this chapter so far? Let's say the frictional unemployment, the asking wage, job search. Can that explain the negatively sloped short-term Phillips curve, right? Well, this is how the argument would work. So let's start with a point like this. So let's say that's 5% unemployment, right? And the rate of inflation is 0%. So that's 0%. Correct? So how would we explain this 5% unemployment? Well, you can think of this in terms of the steady state unemployment rate. Do you remember the steady state unemployment rate? The steady state unemployment rate was was given by L, which is the probability of job loss, divided by L plus H, where H is the probability that an unemployed worker will be hired in this time period, right? So this times 100, but you can think of this as the 5% that you see here, this 5%. So this is a steady state level of unemployment, right? So now let's say that the rate of inflation is pushed up, and this could be as a result of government action. Let's say it's because of expansionary monetary policy. Again, this is not a course in macroeconomics, but let's say that the Fed lowers interest rates in the economy, and this lowering of interest rates causes a flurry of shopping by the shoppers in the economy. Who are the shoppers in the economy? Households, firms, government, the rest of the world. With lower interest rates, households would go out there and shop more because a lot of shopping is financed by credit. With cheaper credit, with a lower interest rate, households will go out there and shop more. Firms too will shop more for new machinery because, again, a lower interest rate makes it cheaper to borrow money with which to go shopping for machinery. Right? So this increased demand in the economy may cause prices to rise or inflation. Right? So let's say that the rate of inflation in the economy climbs from 0% to 7%. Correct? So we have now 7% inflation. Now, let me draw the wage distribution curve for a worker. Right? So let's say you consider a worker here, and this worker has a certain distribution of wages, and let's say the distribution is a symmetric one. Right? So this is wage. On the vertical axis, you have the probability of receiving that wage. Correct? Let's say we have a symmetric type of distribution. With 7% inflation, what is going to happen is that firms are aware that now there is inflation. And what does inflation do to the real wage? The actual purchasing power of the paycheck reduces it, correct? So what firms are going to immediately do is start paying workers more, realizing full well that that's the only way they can hire workers is by raising the amount in the paycheck to compensate for the higher inflation, right? So this is going to cause this entire distribution to shift to the right like this. So this is now the true distribution. This is the new wage distribution. Correct? But the story is like this. The story is that workers may be unaware of this. Workers may be myopic, short-sighted. Workers may be myopic. And so they may not realize that the entire wage distribution has shifted to the right like this. They may still believe that the wage distribution is the old red one. So this is the old distribution. And workers may believe that wage distribution continues to be the old one. Right? So what's going to happen now? Well, now, let's say the worker has a certain asking wage. So this is the job searching worker's asking wage, WA, right? And how do we arrive at the WA? This is, if you remember, arrived at the intersection of the marginal benefit from continued search and the marginal cost from continued search, correct? But what's going to happen now is this: with the wage distribution, the new wage distribution having shifted to the right, it's going to be now more likely that the worker will receive a wage offer that exceeds the asking wage. Correct? So in other words, in this steady state unemployment equation, this H will go up. The probability of being hired, in other words, the probability of receiving a wage that exceeds the asking wage, but that probability rises. Again, why does it rise? It rises because the myopic worker sticks with his old asking wage, not realizing that the entire distribution of wage offers has shifted to the right, making it more likely that this guy will receive now an acceptable wage offer. Correct? So that essentially causes the probability of being hired in any time period to go up, because the probability of, in other words, receiving a wage offer that exceeds the asking wage has gone up. This causes the entire steady state unemployment. If H goes up, what happens to the entire fraction? It goes down. And let's say it falls to 3%. So this will lead us to 7% and 3%. You see, so this kind of thing, this myopia on the part of the worker, may explain the negatively sloped short-run Phillips curve. Correct? So the story here again is that you have inflation, the entire wage distribution shifts to the right, the myopic worker's asking wage hasn't increased, it's remained the same, raising the probability that the worker will receive, the job-searching worker will receive an acceptable offer. In other words, the probability that the unemployed worker becomes hired goes up, and that causes steady-state unemployment to fall. In other words, the amount of unemployment in the economy, we're really talking frictional unemployment here, decreases. But eventually, the worker cannot be myopic forever. Eventually, the worker will realize what's happening, right? And so when the worker realizes this, what is the worker going to do? The worker is going to, the job-searching workers are going to revise their asking wage upward. So this will become the new asking wage, right? In other words, the asking wage goes up in such a way that the real asking wage is back to what it was before. Right? For a time, the real asking wage had fallen, correct, because of inflation. But now the worker has increased his nominal asking wage from WA to this WA prime, thereby bringing the real asking wage back up to its old level, right? So this means that, once again, the probability of receiving an acceptable offer, that probability falls to its old level. So this goes back down to what it was, to its old level. And so this means that the unemployment rate, the steady state unemployment rate, goes back up to the 5%. So eventually the economy is going to go from here back to here. The unemployment rate will go back up from 3% to 5% as workers wise up to the inflation, right? So this tells us that in the long run, the relationship between the rate of inflation and the unemployment rate shall be this vertical line, correct? And that vertical line is called the long run Phillips curve. So this is the short run Phillips curve, and the vertical line is the long run Phillips curve, LR for long run, SR for short run, right? And that really brings me to the end of my lecture part 2 on chapter 12, unemployment.